Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Tom Axworthy. I'm Public Policy Chair here at Massey College. And before we begin the proceedings, I want to introduce our new principal of Massey College, James Urbinski. We're looking forward to working with him assiduously on the public policy program in the coming months. So I want to begin first with the land acknowledgement that Massey College is on the territory of many peoples, particularly the treaty lands of the Mississauga Credit First Nation and the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat. So we have a power-packed afternoon, and I want to also introduce John Meehan, who's our partner at the Bill Graham Center of Contemporary History. The Bill Graham Center and the Public Policy Program at Massey have done many events together in the past few years. He's a very distinguished historian, particularly in Asia-Pacific areas, which are pretty important these days with the rise of China, and also director of the Bill Graham Center. So John will be introducing our very special guests.
Thank you very much, Tom, and good afternoon to everyone here. It's an honor to introduce our distinguished guest today and to congratulate Honorable Lloyd Axworthy on his new book. We look forward to reading it. Very much in the spirit of Bill Graham, who many of you knew, who created our center and did so much besides to promote global citizenship. And I'm so pleased to see some of my students here who are well on their way to becoming global citizens. And when I talk about Canadian foreign relations, the history of Canada's role internationally, there's one period of our history that always piques their interest, 1995 to 2000, when our author was foreign minister of this country, and he promoted a human security agenda, promotion of human rights, R2P, International Criminal Court, Ottawa Convention banning landmines, and many other achievements beside that. And yet, my students note in the years since, we don't seem to be talking about those things much, at least not in the same way. Has Canada changed? Has the world changed? It's a bit of both, I suppose. Lloyd Axworthy is a native of North Battleford, Saskatchewan, and I was fortunate to spend 10 years in your province, in Regina, which was life-changing. Went to United College, now the University of Winnipeg, for his bachelor's. His MA and PhD are both from Princeton. I noticed your thesis there was on housing and urban development, a study in democratic decision-making in Canada. We might need to read that thesis. And of course, then he got politically active in the 60s on all sorts of causes at that time. Gave 27 years of his life to serving his province and our country, 6 years in the Manitoba legislature, 21 in federal parliament, which is where we came to know him. Many cabinet positions, but the one, as I said, he's most famous for is foreign affairs under Prime Minister Jean Chretien. Known for that human security agenda. And I look forward to reading your book because we don't talk enough about it. And it seems to me there's a deep hunger in Canada these days, at least in the circles that I move in here at the university, to know that period and to take from it what is valid as we move forward as a nation, to really establish Canadian leadership in global affairs. So many other achievements besides that, but I will pass on those. One that did stand out for me, though, was in 2012 when you were honored by two Indigenous leaders, Dr. Tobassanaquat Canoe and Dr. Phil Fontaine, with the name White Thunderbird Man and a sacred pipe ceremony for your work in creating an inclusive learning environment for Indigenous students. And I also note, a few years later, you were made a Companion of the Order of Canada, and mainly for your contributions to promoting international human rights and your leadership in post-secondary education, particularly in support of Aboriginal students. We have no better person to have a conversation with the Honorable Lloyd Axworthy than Dr. Janice Stein, who needs no introduction. She's known to all of us here, especially on this campus and beyond, for her comments in the media on precisely Canada's role in the world. Janice is well qualified as the Besler Professor of Conflict Management in the Department of Political Science, founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. I remember being on a committee with you, Janice, in the 90s as that center was getting going. We thought, will this ever take off? It sure has, thanks to your leadership. And Dr. Stein has a wonderful way of taking her vast knowledge and expressing it to a wide audience in ways they can understand, to inform and engage the Canadian public on matters of public policy and international affairs. So without further ado, I hand it over to our author, Honorable Lloyd Axworthy, and Dr. Stein.
Thank you very much, John. I have a very short question to start off. Is the person who opened this session, this Tom Axworthy, is he a relative of yours?
He's the prophet of our family.
He's the prophet, and that really means something from this family, because this is, as I know well, a family that was and is so devoted to the United Church.
Actually, we go one step deeper into that. It was growing up in the north end of Winnipeg. We attended Atlantic Avenue United Church. It was a small church right on the corner of Atlantic and Arlington Street. Those of you who are from Winnipeg will know the turf. And we had the wonderful opportunity that Lois Wilson and her husband Roy, who were our sort of parish ministers, and we had the opportunity to become part of that, what I think most important issue of Canadian history, the social gospel, where we learned that one's faith is lived on earth and you don't worry about heaven all that much. And I've been sort of pretty much following that track ever since. So we had that important system. And when you're growing up in the North End, which was a really pretty tough neighborhood, mixed, it was an incredible way to be introduced into what values do you begin to pick up. And it wasn't until I sort of went to United College that I realized that the major menu for my girlfriends was not halopchi or put-ahead. So I had to go back to my waspy roast beef days when I hit the ripe old age of 18.
Let me stay on the social gospel for just one more minute. I know we're here to talk about international affairs, but just one more minute. Lloyd, do you think that emphasis on mission in the world, that has faded as we become increasingly secular, like so many other countries? Right. How big a gap has that left in our social fabric?
Well, I mean, I can rely upon some pretty good academic work to show that over time there has been sort of a shrinkage of what sort of Robert Putnam called social capital. Places that you went to, and in the North End, I played Little League Baseball at the Ukrainian sort of athletic field, went to Saturday sort of afternoons at Prosvita Hall, then sort of found my way into the United Church, the young people's thing, where we would play at being sort of proto-politics, show up in the legislature on Christmas holidays and stand up and orate, and with all the important things. Like, what was really important in that time was the selling of purple gas in Manitoba to farmers to give them a break on, guess what, on energy cost. Have some things ever changed? No, I don't think so.
You know, I will say I've known Lloyd since he was a graduate student, because my husband and
Michael.
Lloyd were roommates. That's how far back we go. And that social gospel, such an important part, Lloyd, of even then as a young man, the way you thought about the world. Connect that to human security. How did that, because it was a living thing. It was so active. It was such an important part of your thinking. How did that lead you to human security?
Well, Janice, I think like probably everybody in this room, your track of education and the steps you make to all add into a weave. And I think I was at Princeton in the 60s when the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the Vietnam movement were slopping up on the verdant shores of Princeton. And all of a sudden, you couldn't escape from the impact of that. So I became involved and discovered some like-minded Americans where there's a terrific guy named John Morey who was an undergraduate at Berkeley who became a chaplain eventually at Millbury College, which I taught for a year. And all of a sudden, he brought his sense of the Christian faith, which was, that had, I think it was called liberation theology, partly a Catholic idea, and social gospel, and we found ourselves on common ground. So I don't want to make it sound like I was sort of, kind of rolling in the churches every Sunday. But there's no question that my faith led me into the civil rights movement, which was, for me, at the early days, almost a sacred act. And I remember one time I was part of a group that was demonstrating outside the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City, which was when Johnson was being nominated, and Hubert Humphrey and all the rest of it. And there was this wonderful guy called Robert Moses, who stood up and said, and there was maybe about 2,000 of us who had gathered in and around from the New Jersey area, and he said, look, this is a sacred moment. No laughing, no jokes, no crying out, no protest. It's a silent vigil on behalf of the people in Mississippi who have given their lives to try to win the vote for black Americans. I mean, boy, you ever want to be set back and feel something. And then I became one of the members in the Montgomery March, because John Moyer and I sort of took a group of students from Middlebury, and we got into the American system and ended up on a Friday night at the St. Jude's Church areas, about 40 square areas, along with 20,000 other people, and we were listening to everything from, I guess there was Tony Bennett, there was the incredible sort of black singer Harry Belafonte. We were entertained by the tier of popular music until about 11 o'clock, and then we all unfurled our sleeping bags, went to sleep, and got up in the morning and marched with Martin Luther King to the Capitol of Montgomery. Honest to God, that was the closest I think I ever came to what you call a religious epiphany. I just felt all of a sudden you were doing something that testified to one's faith.
See, it wasn't for nothing that I asked him about that experience. I knew that story, and I think it's such an important part
Right.
Of understanding what you were trying to do in international politics.
Mhm.
Lloyd, I really do. I also watched Lloyd from up close as you moved that human security agenda forward. What made it possible in the late 90s? There's a problem with the mic. We're not able to use it, so they're trying to fix it.
No, we still do need the mic.
You still do.
Have to use the
Okay,
mic.
all right. I'm just getting different instructions here in different parts of the ear, as we say. What made it possible in the 90s, Lloyd, for you to move forward an issue of human security? Because Canada really was the leader. The concept of human security was in the academic literature,
Right.
but Lloyd took that and turned it in, frankly, to an actionable international program that so many countries signed onto and used as a framework. How did you do it in the 90s?
Well, I try to write about it in the book. I mean, there's no one single variable or factor that it was a kind of cluster of things, beginning with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And all of a sudden, the old conventions of the Cold War began to dissipate. People said, is there a better way of doing things? Along with the fact that I arrived in Princeton in fall of 1961, and in about 3 weeks, a group of us, political junkies, I think Michael was part of it, went to see John F. Kennedy on the steps of the Trenton State House. Classic thing, all the old poles of the Democratic machine with their fedoras and their big overcoats. And Kennedy comes out with his suit and his kind of, and talks about the new frontier. Honest to goodness, you fall in love. It's like click. And then thirdly, there was a very important sort of development that Jean Chretien won the election in 1993. He thought I needed a little bit more grounding, so he made me Human Resources Development Minister, which I say in the book was like being appointed the turkey at Thanksgiving. You could really be well carved up. And there was some intimation that I've really behaved myself. There might be foreign affairs in the offing. And sure enough, he rescued me after I had sort of gone through what I think can only be called a sort of a somewhat of a retreat from my social policy review. And we won't get into the whole issue of
Let's not get
neoliberalism.
into
Maybe
it.
we should, Actually, we should, because I talk about it in the book. But that was also a moment. I mean, let's be clear. The discretion given to a minister under Jean Chretien is very unlike what the lack of discretion being given to ministers today by prime ministers. We were given an option to make decisions. We were given the invitation to think about things. And I see Senator Grafstein was around at the time. We knew. Jean Chretien's instruction to me is, if you have a good idea, come to me. If it works, I'll take the credit. If it doesn't work, you look for employment. So, and that was about the way it turned out over time. So there's that discretion, Janice, and you were part of an advisory group, because one thing I had learned, kind of having been involved in community organizing in the inner city, and that is that you had to get sort of connected with people. Have to feel that they were involved in the decision, not a decision made for them, but the decision that they were engaged in. And I think that whole idea of broadening out diplomacy from striped pants and sort of cocktail parties, I mean, all those things are useful, but they sure as hell don't give you a lot of sort of political grounding. And all of a sudden I found that Canadians' appetite, I found that when I was the immigration minister in the early 80s, when we had the major movement of the people from Indochina after the war. And do you mind if I elaborate? Okay. Ron Atke, who was the immigration minister under Joe Clark, took me out for lunch. Can you imagine this now when you're a transfer of power? That the conservative, and I will always remember what Ron said to me. He said, being an immigration minister is an act of sacred trust. I said, okay, explain. He said, well, there's a fundamental human right at stake, but there's also an incredible opportunity or responsibility to manage it. Don't do something that makes Canadians lose trust in the system. So there's always that balancing act. And we used the sponsorship program, which, by the way, involved tens of thousands of Canadians in helping to settle the sort of people coming from Vietnam. And they felt that they were part of a solution. They weren't being, it wasn't a PR, it wasn't a hype, it wasn't a press release. They were there. They were actually helping people to get settled. And so that kind of set me up when I went to Foreign Affairs to say, how do we extend the kind of somewhat austere Pearson Building 10th floor atmosphere to make sure there's a lot more people involved. And we set up our own, we had a think tank inside Global Affairs run by a wonderful guy named Stephen Lee, and his job was to go out and connect with all kinds of groups and peoples and academics, and then come back to me and say, hey, this person has an interesting idea. I'd say, I was always curious. I love to steal good ideas, and that we were able to sort of tap in to a lot of rich views around in different people. And then it came that the UN had sort of published its report on social development in 1994, and human security was the issue. And we started looking at it and said, there may just be a place for Canada. And at the same time, just as that was beginning to germinate in my head and around us, along came the opportunity to get engaged in the landmine process. And here, I want to, cut me off if I'm going too long. No, don't cut me off, please, okay. I discovered that there was a group of Foreign Service officers, people like Jill Sinclair, Mark Wazowski, and Bob Lesson. Well, John Allen know who I'm talking. They were the spear carriers. They had already established important connections with the sort of campaign, civic of the non sort of government groups. That they had already made contact with a number of other countries, so that there was already a process in motion. And here, when we sort of badmouth or push back on, the bureaucrats, I got to tell you, as a minister, by that time I was pretty seasoned. I'd been around. I got elected in '79 federally, so I kind of knew the scene. I thought, oh my God, these are real pros, and they know what they're doing, and I better listen to them. And from that, we went to the next step. That same group said to me one day, look at the whole issue of treaty to ban landmines is stuck in Geneva. There was a convention on disarmament, which was known in the trade as an abattoir where good causes went to die. And they were kicking around the whole issue of if we're going to do a ban trial, we're going to wiggle a little bit so that you can have a ban on landmines beginning in 1930 if there happens to be an outbreak of war between Thailand and Manila. I mean, it was just that kind of silliness. And again, it was our civil servants and some people on my staff who said, wait a minute, we're going to invite a group of people to come to Ottawa, this is in the fall of '96, to break the stalemate. Well, we didn't quite break it. But you could see the dividing lines coming up.
You did something really, really interesting at that point,
Yeah.
Lloyd, because it wasn't only inviting diplomats.
No, that's right.
So tell that story.
We were involving civil society in the discussion. That was I think that was a breakthrough in the way we made foreign policy. We invited a lot of people from different walks of, from the academic community, from the NGO communities, from people who, look, I was a party person. I went and talked to liberals about this. We organized meetings privately. There was no big sort of dance about it. And then we began to sort of decide that there was something we could do that would incorporate all this kind of movement. And the turning point was I spoke to a group at CIC this morning and said I also had an 11-year-old son named Stephen. And on the eve of the end of this little conflab we put together, we were visiting an exhibit at Lansdowne Park, and with all these weapons, with the big corrugated things and everything else. And he said, "What do those do?" I said, most of them kind of, chew your gut out. Oh, said my son. 11-year-olds are always interested in things like that. And then he said, "Well, there's something wrong with that." And I said, "Of course." He said, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, you're the minister, for God's sake." Well, nothing like an 11-year-old telling you, do your job. Well, I took it home, and when that decision came, it was the classic Harry Truman case of when does the buck stop here? And so we met Saturday morning I was to do the benediction on this meeting, do the normal thing. Yes, we've all agreed that landmines are bad and we should have a treaty, but there was no next step. There was no how do you do it. So I had two speeches, A and B, depending on how I felt. And I felt kind of bullish this morning, so I said, so as a result, I'm inviting you all to come back to Ottawa a year from now to sign a treaty. And there was this gasp. And some of the NGOs all of a sudden, Jesus, he's actually saying, come back and sign a treaty. And then some of the big guys all of a sudden say, that jerk, that cheeky foreign minister from Canada is telling us all to come back. That's our domain. Canadians, middle powers don't do things like that. And in between was the Canadian media who said, oh, actually he's kind of gone off the deep end again. Don't pay any attention to him, until they began to see it began to work. So, ipso facto, a year later, we had 120 countries signing the treaty. We came within seconds, literally, of having the Americans sign it. And John would know this because he was part of the system. I had asked for an extension of the meetings in Oslo that were going on to draft the treaty. And at the time, Sir Pat Leahy, who was a dear friend of mine, was a senator from Vermont, a guy named Bobby Mueller, head of the Vets for Vietnam, said, "We think we can get Bill Clinton on side." So we worked the phones, we worked everything. And we used again our diplomatic corps to push. And I remember Sandy Berger was he was a national security guy. I was in the Pearson building about 7 o'clock, and he called me. He says, I think the president's in. And I was like, this is the story I tell in the book. Then I called my wife Denise and said, you know that bottle of Macallan we've been saving for an occasion? I said, gee, I think we can celebrate. I got home about 7:45, and Sandy Bergen phone said, he caved into the Pentagon. He said, but he's prepared to make a deal. And nobody knows it. He said that he makes sure that the United States will abide by 90% of the conditions of that treaty, and also we're going to put a lot of money into the demining and the support for handicap. Not a bad deal to cut, actually. Overall.
And they did observe, and
Huh?
they have observed.
And they have
it.
lived up to totally. And so we still open the bottle of Macallan, and but the next day we had 120 people. And I want to make one more point, if I might. We talk a lot about Canadian wanting to belong to other people's clubs, G7s and IMFs and NATO's. That was the beginning when we set up our own multilateral institution, the Human Security Network, because all of a sudden we had 120 ministers, officials, people from NGOs from 120 other countries. We got to know them. They were friends. We talked to them. The Norwegian minister really, he says, this human security, tell me what the hell it's about. So we talked. He said, can we join in? And within about 4 or 5 months, we had set up a human security network, our own international organization, 13 countries, 7 big NGOs, the International Red Cross, and a number of UN agencies that would meet to start talking, what's our next step? And we got the treaty signed and it started rolling, and then within 3 months, Bill Pace from the World Federalists came along and asked to meet with me, and he said, look, we're the NGO coalition behind the International Criminal Court, and it's kind of stuck in the politics. Would you, the Canadians, do the same thing you did on landmines? Well, why not? We'd already ginned up all these ambassadors around the world. We had to give them something to do the second time. And all of a sudden, we became sort of the political management for the International Criminal Court. So it gave us a period of, we actually had our own constituency. And boy, that's something we don't have now.
I mean, that's completely true. You know, there's just 2 pieces of context to add to what Lloyd just said. To go back to immigration for just one moment, Canadian birth rate is now at its lowest ever. It's 1.2. And you need 2.2 to replace. We are at 1.2. I don't know where that 0.2 of a kid is. I keep looking. I never find the kid, but that's where we are. And 97% of our population growth is from immigration.
Yes.
So I couldn't agree more with Lloyd about how important that is to our future. And we have a tremendous amount.
Janice, it's under threat now because
I know that.
What's happening is you start looking at the trajectory of public opinion surveys. We've gone from a 70% support for immigration 3 years ago, down to 40% now. And I'm afraid we're going to hit bottom. I mean, I think embryonics and stuff are out in the field right now examining where Canadians are because we didn't manage it. We turned immigration over to a way of compensating for our lack of funding higher education, for giving business the right to get proper workers. We made it into sort of a solution for somebody else's problem.
That's
and now
right.
we're paying a huge price.
So that's one where, again, taking it forward to the present,
Yeah.
I mean, this is an enormous challenge that we have to address in a timely and intelligent way, frankly, if we're not going to sacrifice.
Janice, a couple more points, and then we'll throw it open for questions.
Okay, one last quick one, Lloyd. You said that the door opened for everything that you did because the Cold War ended. And there was an optimism and a hope and a UN system that had been deadlocked for 40 years, all of a sudden, promised to be functional. You know, James Orvinsky came into our life, your principal, at the same time when he worked for Doctors Without Borders in Rwanda and just did heroic work and came back and joined in this, in probably the most invigorated period of Canadian diplomacy that we've had. Well, the Cold War's not back, but we are in a world now where first of all, we're in a world of active war.
Yeah.
Second of all, we're in a world where big power rivalry is back with a vengeance. Thirdly, we're in a world where, and I've said this to James, I hope he's going to take this on, where international law and international human law has to be rethought given the nature of the world that we're living in. The old shibboleths just don't work. Tell us how you take what you were able to accomplish and how we can take this forward into a very different world, Lloyd, than the one that you were navigating when you were foreign minister.
This may sound like a strange answer, but I think we're also in a time of opportunity. I mean, there's no question. I just finished reading Anne Applebaum's book on Autocracy, Inc., where they talked about this kind of growing network of the thugs around the world, and that there's no question it's a real thing. What we're not answering is how do you provide the counterpoint? What's the antidote? Is it simply, again, sort of beefing up more military? Of course, that's one of the answers. But I think the concept of human security provides answers as well, because what they're moving into is they're convincing countries and people in Asia and Africa and so on that they have a better system. Because under our old international development paradigms and stuff, we stopped helping people, we stopped connecting, we stopped involving them. We were playing the top-down game. I mean, look, even in the diplomatic negotiations around the Middle East issue right now, Joe Biden is a top-down diplomat. He's not engaging in terms of a much broader sense of discussions on the humanitarian and the terrorist side. The two have to be connected. So my point is, right now, as Canadians, I think we have opportunities, maybe in a totally different set of clusterings. What is a big international issue? It's water. How many people are forced into migration, are forced into sort of the most serious conflicts over who gets the fresh water? Is it the farmers, or is it the cattlemen? I mean, it's something out of an old Western. What do we do about the way in which water has become a destructive force? And yet Canada is one of the big managers of fresh water. And I do write in the book, my last, as I was concluding, you always have to end, what they say in vaudeville, kind of with a song and a dance. I ended with a proposition saying, the one thing we have to do as Canadians is to begin to fully recognize, acknowledge, and do something about the fact that Indigenous Canadians are not recognized as a founding community of Canada. And the moment we start working towards that change of incorporating them as part of our system, we're also going to be making a lot different decisions. We're setting up a water agency in Winnipeg next week. Tom's had a lot to do with that. I think they should be the president and chairman of the board should be from the Indigenous community. They've been stewarding water for centuries, and we're just learning the game. The same thing is true on critical minerals. The same thing is true on sustainability. Look at what the Iroquois Confederacy has as a basic principle of their governance. It's called the seventh generation principle. That you make a decision, you have to do it, keeping in mind not just what your kids and grandchildren will be, but what their kids and grandchildren will be. And you're held accountable for not making decisions that screw their world up. So we've got a lot to incorporate, and the way to do it is not to tinker on the side. We're into land negotiations, we're into judicial things. That's a long-term really snipping at the edges. The fundamental thing is that Canadians we're at a stage where we have to redefine ourselves a little bit. We've kind of lost our mojo. I mean, the last big thing we did in this country was the Charter. And since then, we've been tinkering.
That's 40 years ago.
Now we have to find something else to give us identity. And what's more is to say, let's recognize the historical transgression, let's correct it, let's incorporate it, and let's find out a whole new fresh breath of air on governance, on economics, on environment, on foreign policy. And all of a sudden, in the Arctic area, 65% of the residents are Inuit. The responsibility of taking some serious governance of our Arctic programs belongs to those who know what the hell they're doing up there, and not somebody who kind of was raised in Mississauga, or for that matter, Winnipeg.
Lloyd, let's.
Okay.
I'm going to sneak one more question
I was
in.
going to say,
despite
last point, Jen.
Despite what Tom just said to me.
I'm glad you can talk back to him.
Oh, I do it all the time. Tom knows.
She was my boss, actually, at the moment.
So, you just mentioned the Arctic. The Arctic is actually moving now to front and center in Canadian defense policy, Canadian foreign policy. But there's a very truncated discussion of what security means in the Arctic at the government level. What would you do? What would your priorities be in the Arctic? And understanding that this is probably the single most important issue to the United States. It is highest on their agenda when they talk to us over and over again. They are worried about the fact that we are absent in the Arctic. That's their language.
Sure, and that was the language that they were using when, as Canadians, we initiated the settlement of an Arctic Council, which brought together all the circumpolar governments and the circumpolar Indigenous people to start making decisions about science, about culture, about social programs, and about security. And as a result, it's one of the last places, Janice, where we actually may have a chance to talk to the Russians about things. I mean, I took a lot of crap when I was foreign minister about my, quote, constructive engagement. I went to talk to Fidel Castro, and we talked to the Chinese, and we knew that we were supporting human rights, but didn't mean to say that we didn't have something in interest we better communicate. And I still think right now that taking that model and applying it to a broader system of things, and people said, well, how the hell do you deal with Putin? You don't have to deal with Putin. The new diplomacy is involved not just in sort of summits of leaders, it's also involved in having scientists get together and talk about what do you do about the vanishing ice. It's getting sort of Inuit people together to talk about how do we make sure that our culture is and our language is not extinguished. Sheila Watt-Cloutier, when she was head of the Circumpolar Conference about several years ago, took the United States to the Inter-American Court, challenging the fact that their emissions were causing major form of genocide of Inuit people in the north. Sure, it got thrown out, but it was a real precedent setting that all of a sudden there's a different way of doing things. And here we are, Canadian. We've got a population of people who really get they know what's going on in the north, partly because we've so badly mistreated them up there over the years. But the enormous amount of imagination and energy coming out is something that I think is a real asset to us. It's a real boon to Canada, but it's something that can't be done exclusively by Indigenous people. We have to get on side, those of us who are non-Indigenous. And that's why I conclude my book by saying, let's start building the blocks towards that third pillar, and with that goes all the recognition and all the assets and opportunities that Indigenous people can bring, as well as then the new diversity of Canada, because you're opening up the whole system to a very different set of premises and principles. So that's my answer.
So just one quick note, and then we're going to you. The Arctic Council was set up by a private foundation in this country.
That's
and
right.
again, it's
It's
so
the Gordon
important to
Foundation.
remember that, right?
And
it was,
Franklin Griffiths is here at the back, who
yes,
was,
he is.
there you
who
go.
was our
There he
leader in the Gordon Foundation for
That's
getting
right.
it
That's
done.
right.
It was and so just again, to think about the assets we have in this country, it was done in partnership with your government, Lloyd, and the first ambassador, Arctic ambassador in this
Mary
country's history was Mary Simon,
Right.
who's our Governor General.
So look, we have all the pieces to put together. But
And
we have
Janice
to
was
get
on our
somebody to
board.
Okay.
Over to you.
Okay, let's give a hand to Janice for leading our initial discussion. So, ladies and gentlemen, we'll open it up for questions from the floor. We have mics, and after initial period of questions, then we'll have a break. We'll have a reception, a wine and cheese reception, and Lloyd will sign some books if you're so generous enough to buy some, all right? So, who'd like to start with a question? You have to put your mic on.
immigration slash fertility rate problem, what do you think is the best way for Canada to approach, increasing the fertility rate or improving it so that the population is sustained while making sure the skepticism for immigration is no longer, and maybe not an issue, but it's better than it was before?
So it was a little hard to hear, so I'm going to repeat the question for you, Lloyd. The question is, give us some concrete proposals for how we restore trust in our immigration system to make it viable and sustainable in this country.
Some of you may know I chair an NGO called the sort of Global Refugee Migration Council. We were set up in 2019 when the UN had brought in these major conferences on migration, and the feeling of the time was, UN was kind of flying at 30,000 feet in terms of its broad commitments. Somebody had to be at 5,000 feet to figure out what to do about it. And so we have this council, and we're doing a series of issues. I think probably the most pronounced thing we did is the whole notion of repossessing Russian assets and converting them back for Ukraine for their use in the battle. But I'm also working on a project in Halifax and Winnipeg to start providing a way in which bringing women who've been sexually abused during the movements up to Central America and to come to Canada to be properly treated. We're trying to do practical things that will provide models. But that's not the answer to the broader issue. What I'm going to say here is our problem is that we're using immigration to solve other problems. Look at, as I said, I was the human resource minister. We banked the whole issue of federal direct support of universities into the Canada transfer thing. David, you remember those days. And we said, but we put no conditionality on the provinces. So we spent a lot of money on education by building sort of bridges, doing tax cuts, all those wonderful things that make people learn better. And as a result, and in the meantime, the provinces were freezing their tuitions. I was a university president for 10 years. And Neil Besner was my provo. And by God, we just know we could all take our shirts off if we were in a family audience and show you the scars. The two levels of government basically decided that the only solution to funding universities and colleges was to bring in foreign international students and gouge them 5 times what they pay for tuition. That's not a public policy. That's an escape hatch. I mean, and from the beginning we said, what are you guys doing? And now we're paying a big price because while they're bringing all those people in, they weren't building any more houses or providing any more health care or providing any other services. And one thing I learned when I was an employment and human resource minister, if you're making major changes, you better help people adjust to them because the market's not going to do it for them. So that's one problem. I would get back to saying, what is the purpose of immigration? It isn't to help finance universities, and it isn't designed to help business get sort of low-cost workers in fast food restaurants. That's the starting point. And then secondly, though, I think we have to go back and revisit the notion. We have to rebuild immigration around that basic premise that it's a human right. And has been recognized for centuries or so. And then, but also bring a management system in. I mean, we do have, I heard some papers today that with the new advent of AI and all the rest of it, the ability to start providing a technology answer to sort of managing large numbers of people and making sure that they're vetted and corrected and where they go. But we're not using that technology yet. We're using it to do face recognition to see if they're criminals or not, as opposed to finding out whether, what are the numbers. And we don't, look at, you set me off here.
I know.
Yeah.
We do not have a national labor market policy in this country. We have a fragmented system, province by province. And if you're going to deal with immigration as an answer, you better well have a policy and not leave it up to Doug Ford or God forbid, Sir Daniel Smith to do it.
We have a question at the back.
So
and then,
there's just one piece of evidence here to add to what Lloyd is saying. Canada is the world's laggard in adopting AI in government. The world's laggard of the developed countries.
A question at the back, and then Ann Golden, and then there's some of your former students, Lloyd, when you were a professor, who wanted to know why you only gave them a B+. But we can't have that.
Hi,
Slip of the pen. That's all.
Jad. I had the honor of meeting you earlier this year, and I was excited by the concept of how ministers had a lot more autonomy back in Chretien's government. How can we go back to where ministers can become leaders for themselves and back to the autonomy for where we actually have, Canadians who understand in their policy areas, creating policy for this country? And I feel like we're also shifting towards more partisanship and like worried about
You should see
appeasing
the
leadership.
faces in the room up front as you ask that question. They
I
alternate
could,
between...
I could give you a two-word answer, but I won't because it would get me into big trouble. But I would start with this thing, is that part of that sort of elimination or regression, it was part of a much larger pattern of basically reducing all the instruments and tools of accountability and transparency. The Liberal Party, of which I am a member and have been since I was 16 years old, now has no safeguards whatsoever. And I see my friend David calling it, as a party, we used to be a community. We used to argue with each other. The left and the right would sort of go after each other, but it was an accommodation. Now it's take no prisoners. It's centralized. And in the 2016 convention, we basically, the Prime Minister then stripped out every single form of accountability that was built into the constituency level, the regional level, and the provincial level. So it begins with the evisceration of our political party system. And I think that means that the center doesn't have to pay attention anymore to kind of what they call the regional sort of power brokers or to the local regions. They can also, so centralization, and it didn't start, it's not ending with Justin, it started with his father, and maybe even before then. I think that's, but each Prime Minister since then has added another layer of control. I mean, I think right now, when I talked about ministerial discretion, right now, if you were a Minister of the Crown in the federal government of Canada, your Chief of Staff is chosen for you by the Prime Minister's office. That is, I think, is generally called a commissar system. They report to the center, not to the minister. I could never have done the landmine treaty if I hadn't been able to choose people. The work we did on child soldiers, I got James Urbanski and Eric Hoskins and people, because external affairs didn't have the competence at this point in time. When David and I were working on the peace building, remember we put together the idea that 3 departments, foreign affairs, international development, and defense would get together on a peace building strategy. We did that, and we weren't told to do it. We just thought that made a hell of a lot of policy sense.
Were your speeches approved by the PMO before you gave them?
Are you? Sure they were, yeah.
Sometimes they would have to correct grammar, but that was all. Anne.
Thank you, Ann Golden. Just to go back to the question of immigration, I think that in recent decades, most Canadians have come to really appreciate the benefits of immigration for enriching our way of life from a cultural point of view, but also they understand the importance for productivity and for innovation. But I think, and I see this a bit from a municipal perspective, I think the concerns have to do with the lack of planning. And I think as we watch our cities enter what some of us perceive to be a downward spiral because of service decline, be it health, be it education, be it transit, be it all these things, we are not planning for the immigration. In the last 2 years, we doubled immigration from 250,000 to 500,000 a year, half of whom come to the Greater Toronto Area, with no evidence that I can see of any planning or any funding for municipalities for this purpose. And I know that you had a lot to do with the municipal visions. When I think back, your role in Winnipeg and in Manitoba, but I don't see a lot of hope for this in the near future, given politics.
And you're absolutely, look, you put your finger on it. Immigration is being used to solve other problems. But the reality is, at 250,000, there was a level of settlement and adjustment that could be managed. You double that without putting 5 more cents into the system to make it work, or you do it without engaging the municipalities who are on the front lines. You do it without getting the provinces together to talk about how do we work jointly on these issues. I mean, you're not doing governance anymore. You're responding to somebody else's complaint. And that's, I go back to the Ron Atke statement. It's a sacred trust. And that means not just sort of paying religious obeisance, it's also making sure that people maintain that trust, that you're governing the system to make sure that it doesn't get out of control. And as a result, we've given food and fodder to all the kind of xenophobes out there, and there's all kinds of them, who all of a sudden have found somebody else to blame. And sure, they blame Justin Trudeau, but the reality is what they're blaming is a system that going right back into the beginning of 2000, we started using immigration not as a tool, as you say, for giving people new settlement, to doing economic growth, to diversifying what we eat and what we think and what we read and what we sing. Here's a comparison. When I was the employment minister in the 80s, the cod fishery collapsed in the Atlantic. For 2 years, our government, we supported the cod fishery, the fishermen of the Atlantic, until they were able to find alternate employment. We were able to revise things in the communities. Over time, it took 10, 15 years to regain it. When we, as you said, Ann, when you double from 250 to 500 in a year's span, you're asking for big time trouble. And that's the problem, and we're still not going back to saying, well, now how do we, it's not we're trying to correct the system, we're trying to band-aid the system right now to get through the election.
So we have a question at the back, and then Jerry Grafstein, and then we're going to break for the reception.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm the director of the Forum for Leadership on Water, where I work closely with Tom. And I wanted to ask you, going back to the Canada Water Agency, which we've had a lot of work on, how do you inspire trust when we're really in an age of mistrust, both in the public-facing government, but also within the parties themselves? We're looking at an election, and we're trying to inspire trust in the Canada Water Agency, which is the biggest movement the federal government's done in water in 50 plus years. So how would you inspire trust in keeping that institution alive?
Well, I would do something about Lake Winnipeg. That would be a beginning. You've got, it's the 8th largest, Tom's the 8th or 9th largest?
It's as large as the Great Lakes.
Large as the Great Lakes. And yet it's dying because nobody's doing very much. There's a number of NGOs who are kind of saying, do something about it. Tom and I have cottages on the shore, so we have a vested interest. But nevertheless, we're watching what was a beautiful lake that provided outlets for tens of thousands of people in the prairies, and all of a sudden it's full of algae and it's full of zebra mussels and everything else, because we're allowing two things. The Manitoba Hydro uses as its catchment area, and number two, the city, when it dumps all its you-know-what into the water that comes into the lake. And nothing's being done at any level. The only thing Winnipeg's talking about is building a new filter plant sometime in the next century. So, but I think that the water agency, because it's new and brand new, if they get the right people and just don't turn it into another sort of offset of a federal ministry, but actually give it that independence and some resources. And what I would really like to see it do, and I know Tom said about this, and Terry Duguid, the MP who was instrumental, is to mainly make it an international center.
Yes.
That we could really say an incredible testament to other countries around the world who are all wrestling with this issue of how do you manage water, which is the most precious thing, more precious than oil and gas. How do we manage it, and how Canada can be sort of the avatar of making that happen?
The agency could convene experts from around the world annually, and the International Joint Commission is still the body the world comes to avoid conflict over water.
Yeah, that's right. So what an opportunity we have, and that's but one way we have to come at it, and Jerry, I'm taking up your time a little, is I hope that Canadians would see that one of the ways of rebuilding our sense of who we are as Canadians is to make sure that in this crucial issue of water, that Indigenous community has a voice that's front and center, because frankly, they're the ones who really know how it works. And there's a wonderful statement, a small book written by a professor at the University of Ottawa, who talks about how the elder was talking to his granddaughter and simply saying, well, you know, the Queen's people came over and took our lands and our water, but they eventually will understand that it doesn't belong to them. And I think that's where we're at with today. It has to be more, it has to be a broadly shared, and I really believe, to my roots, that we can really revitalize this country by taking on something of that scope.
Last question to Jerry Grafstein, and then we'll have a reception where you can meet Lloyd, and we'll clear out the chairs and have some fellowship together. Jerry.
I'll be very brief. Lloyd, all of us, or many in this room, started in politics as young lawyers, knocking on doors.
Right.
And we did that. Can't hear you, Jerry. Many in this room, I believe, started as young activists. Lloyd, Tommy, and I started as liberal young activists.
Right.
And I was shocked, because I'm still involved in organizing provincial and municipal and federal elections for candidates. And I'm trying to get young people involved. And I'm shocked, absolutely shocked, that in the last 4 or 5 or 6 elections, federal, provincial, and municipal, that nobody's voting.
Yeah.
Nobody's voting. You can, St. Paul's was lost by 526 votes. And it was the historic low. And so when I talk to young people and say, get involved, they're not interested. And they say to me, the reason they're not interested is there's nothing in it for the governments give them nothing. Nothing. Not housing, not schooling, not a good job opportunity. And so I say to you, the biggest problem that I see in the country is a lack of young people getting active at the grassroots in politics. What do we do about it?
Yeah, let me just say for one moment that young people are completely engaged. I've never had a better generation of young people. They're just not engaging in the traditional ways.
Well, I think that goes back to the point that Jerry's raising. That my contact, beginning with my son, who is zealously political but won't join a political party because he says, what's the point? Because and I'm being very specific, when we converted to being a movement, it meant that anybody could walk off the street, put $2 down and vote on who the leader will be, who the candidate will be. And so the idea of being a militant, of being engaged, of being recognized, going to a convention. I mean, you and I, and Tom, remember the big debates we had over foreign ownership? And we were debating with senior cabinet ministers into the night in the Chateau Laurier till 2 in the morning. Now you go to a convention and there's an hour and a half given to Canada's international role. We probably have one American, one Brit, and one somebody from a token from, I don't know, the Nigeria to come and talk to Canadians about our foreign policy. And then at 10:30, all the resolutions are packaged and then dropped in the round garbage can. Come on, young people aren't dumb. And I agree totally with Janice. There's an engagement out there. I've just, being here in Toronto the last 34 hours, I talked to the junior fellows here at Massey for dinner last night. And wow, I mean, there was a group of young professionals at the CIC conference this morning who were talking about the role of AI, talking about the Darien Gap, talking about the whole necessity of dealing with Russia. Creative, smart. Politically involved in a party? No. And I think that the responsibility for a political party is its leadership. And I think that I hate to be sort of quite so critical. That's where, if you don't believe that the party really is your community, your home, and your vehicle, and you simply deal with it as something to kind of manage as opposed to engage, then you're not going to have that youth involvement that we desperately need. And I believe at some point they're going to find a different way of expressing it. One of the most interesting movements around the world, including in Canada, is the whole move towards deliberative democracy, not worrying about the parliamentary system of large forums. I was at the Victoria Forum 3 weeks ago, 500 people coming together from all walks of life to talk about policy, and it was sponsored by the Senate, and the senators were there, but they weren't they weren't at the steering. They were listening, and increasingly these deliberate. I was involved in a McMaster program that Red Wilson paid for, that about hundreds of Canadians are talking about the future of Canada to the year 2050. So I think with the kind of communication system we have, and leadership from universities and from individual units. Look at Yukon has now set up a major sort of deliberative democracy system to come up with a new electoral system. When was the last time we talked electoral system? The election of 2050, and then it was forgotten. And look, people don't forget when they've been gussed, and I think that's part of the issue. People simply don't trust the system.
Well, on that happy note, we'll... So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attendance. Thank you to Lloyd and Janice for a wonderful discussion. And now we will break for a reception. You'll have a chance to spend a little more time and perhaps asking some questions to Lloyd, who will be also signing some books. So thank you very much.